this is kind of the sequel. I am going to be talking about payroll records. Okay. And the reason I'm going to be talking about payroll records is because when we go out on audits and we look in the retiree folders, we're always recommending that you use payroll to calculate the 3-year average salary. So a lot of people never do look at payrolls. This is just going to give you some of the basics on, here's the things that a lot of the payrolls will cover. And also ask that you just hold your questions till the end of my part. Be happy to answer them at that point. So what Karen Shea has found is that people do get payroll records and they call her saying, well, what do I do now? So here's the answers to that. They're going over the basics, the things you see. We'll also cover a situation where you can't take the numbers straight from the payroll when you're calculating someone's salary. You'll have to actually do an adjustment. And during our audits, when we do the average salaries, we put each year side by side. If you do that, it helps you to see patterns because often people get raises at the same time each year, or they get various stipends at the same time each year. So you'll get to see the patterns. You look at payrolls for 3 or 4 years, you can figure out what the different departments do. So we do it side by side rather than just having one big long horizontal row of 150 something weeks. Okay, so within the booklet, page 4, typically the left side of the booklet has actual payroll and the right side of the booklet has the slides. Our communications people were able to match the two up pretty well. So this is what I'm referring to as a very basic payroll. Has the individual's name at the top. It also has the town name at the top. And the company name is over in the top right. This is a Munis payroll. Munis is very reader friendly. They aren't all this nice. If anyone uses ADP, those are tougher to read. But again, you can get used to it after a while. So what we have sort of in the middle there are, you see a number and then the word salary. So the number is the pay code. The salary is the description of the pay code. And here, this person has 2 salary lines. If you look at the dates on the left, you can see that the check dates are 1 week later than the next. So this isn't bi-weekly payroll, it's weekly payroll. The salary is split into 2. I don't know why, and it doesn't really matter why, because if you keep looking at the following weeks, you can see every single check is for the same amount. So $14.28 is going to be the base pay. Why they're splitting it into 2, the payroll department probably has their reasons. Either the money's coming from 2 different sources, or it's some kind of tracking for their budget. But that's stuff that you don't need to worry about. If it's clear that every single week it's split in 2, but the amounts are always the same, then that's clearly base salary. The other thing on this, on the far right, are deductions. In this particular report, the administrator was able to just show the 2 retirement deductions. If a payroll person gets you a full report, you'll also see things like taxes and insurance in the deduction fields. But the payroll gets a lot shorter if you can cut out the taxes and the insurances. The other thing is you can see hours are 0, but that's because this person's getting a salary, so it doesn't matter how many hours they work. When you get to the top of the next page's payroll, you can see that instead of every check just having 2 salary fields, the one at the top now has the 2 salary fields plus 2 retro codes. So And this is another thing, once you get used to looking at payrolls, weeks that have different codes will start to pop out more easily. And the thing we ask about retro pay if someone's retiring is just note the effective dates of the retro pay. Because if they fall within the 3-year average salary, you use the full amount of the retro. But if they're covering 4 or 5 years, you're not going to use all the retro pay in the 3-year average salary. So we do like to see it somewhere noted what the effective dates are. Then the third page of payroll, which is page 8 in the booklet, I've got this person's final couple paychecks. So another thing to look at when someone's retiring is go to their last check and first make sure if they've gotten a lump sum for sick or vacation time that deductions have not come out of it. In this particular case, nothing is labeled sick or vacation time, but the code and the description there, NOP, it's just a generic code for non-pensionable. So probably every system has some type of just generic no pension, not pension. You might see vacation no pension or sick no pension. So in this case, you can tell deductions were not taken on the payout of lump sum accrued time. The other thing to notice is that the salary figures are less than they had been for all the prior years. So I would assume this person is retiring in the middle of the week. If you do the math, it's 60% of what they had gotten the prior week, so that's 3 days. So if it makes sense to you that Wednesday was their last day paid, maybe they're retiring not on Saturday or Sunday, but in the middle of the week. It's another thing to look for. All right, that was the very basic payroll. This one is still pretty basic. Their first check, you can see, is 35 hours of hourly. So this person, they are tracking the hours. The second check, the one on October 11th, there's some hourly. There's also vacation and sick time. But you'll notice that, again, if you add all 3 of those together, it's still 35 hours. So this person is clearly scheduled to work 35 hours a week. And if they take vacation or sick time, they are allocating them to each of those. The grand total is the same, the 793.54. So then we see some new codes on page 12 of the booklet, in addition to hourly, vacation, sick. The March 21st paycheck, see some code number 431 ADJ. What is that? Well, all we know is it's some kind of adjustment. So if you run into something like this when you're looking at the payrolls, you do have to ask either the department the person works for or the payroll department what exactly that adjustment is for. And then when you finally get an answer, all right, now you can figure out whether it's regular compensation or not. I wouldn't just assume that the payroll people handled it correctly as regular comp. That same check underneath the adjustment, there you also see 595 longevity. So longevity pay, that is regular compensation. You don't have to worry about whether that's regular comp or not. And then the final check on page 12, there's hourly sick time and bereavement pay. So you hadn't seen the bereavement code before, but again, it's 3 out of the 35 hours. So it's part of the base, your 35-hour schedule. So bereavement pay is regular comp. The next thing I'm going to point out is what happens when this person works more than 35 hours in a week. So page 14 of the booklet, we have 2 pages of payroll, 6 and 7. there's several weeks where the person worked more than 35 hours. So if you're scheduled for 35 hours and once in a while you work a couple extra hours, those extra hours are not considered a regular compensation. And so here they've paid them under an OT code. So there's no deductions held. It's nice to see one that's done correctly. And again, it is, if you check the hourly rate by dividing the amount paid by the number of hours, you'll find out that it's paid at time and a half for that OT. But even if it was just paid at the normal rate, those additional hours still would not have been regular compensation. And again, we're getting to the end of their career. So sometimes you'll see this person actually has two checks dated the same date. The prior person did not get two checks on one date at the end. They just got one. This person has two. The first part of the check is hourly for 1 day, then unused vacation time for 3 days, and then 1 day of personal time. So again, this is someone who didn't work a full week their last week. They worked the 1 day and took one personal day. And then you see a $5,000 vacation no, which would be short for vacation no pension on that person's last check. So again, they didn't take deductions on your unused accrued time. Why it's paid in two different checks, I don't know, but that's another thing payroll people might do for their own reason, but it doesn't affect anything on your end. Okay, if you look at the payroll on page 18 of the booklet, it says payroll page 9 at the top. You'll see that there's a lot more going on with this person. This is part of a firefighter's payroll. And one of the first things you might notice is if you look in the hourly column, there's a 42 there. And I'm not an expert on firefighter schedules, but typically when you're looking at firefighter payroll, they're getting 42 hours in a week or 84 hours biweekly. It's not 40 hours plus 2 overtime, it's 42 straight hours. And if you start looking at some of the 10 to 12 codes that are listed there, it's going to be obvious that a few of them, yeah, this is clearly regular comp, but there's also going to be a couple where you just don't know what they mean. There's an abbreviation for something that could be anything. You know, what ALS stands for is not obvious to me. What MedDis is not obvious to me. So if you don't know, ask the payroll people again. Some of these things are listed, or they should all be listed in contracts if they're being paid out typically and they're in a union. So if you have the contract, you can look it up, see if you can figure out what exactly that pay is for. The other thing with police and fire, typically holiday pay works differently at different places. Some are paid for holidays as they happen, like this person is. You'll see two checks in a row that have a holiday pay and then one that doesn't. So because we are in January, one would have been for Christmas, and the next week would have covered the New Year's holiday. There are places that will pay the holidays in one lump sum or maybe semi-annual for a holiday. So again, as you look through payrolls, you'll learn what your particular units do. Another thing is if you look at the totals, the one January 4th pay is about $1,500. The next week, it's closer to $2,000. That's easily explained because there's almost $500 of overtime that week. And then if you look at January 18th, the total is now 3,500. So it's really jumping around. So just look at the code, see if you can figure out why the totals are jumping. That third one, there's $1,500 in longevity pay included. So the week after this one would be lower because it wouldn't have a $1,500 longevity pay. And again, if we jump to the end of this person's career, in this case, they're getting one check for the last week they worked. So the bigger box that we've highlighted is the last week worked. And then a week later, they're getting a check that only contains the unused vacation. So they're not getting two checks in 1 week. This one was spread out over 2 different weeks. But again, no deductions came out on the unused time. And if you compare the hourly amount to the, well, you can see it's 21 hours worked and then 21 hours of sick time. So that's their normal 42 hours in a check. The other things they're getting, if you looked at prior weeks, you would see that the stipends and things were consistently the same amount week after week. So those weren't changing even in the final. So they definitely worked the entire 2 weeks or got paid for the entire the entire full week. This wasn't like a Tuesday or Wednesday stopping. And the last person we're going to go over is starting on page 22 of the booklet. So in addition to hourly pay and sick pay and vacation pay, there's also no pay. So these guys are tracking the no pay hours. Obviously, the amount paid is 0, but there are numbers in the hours column. So you can see that this person is scheduled for 40 hours every single week. Whether they get 36 hours regular and 4 vacation, or like further down where they have 8 hours and 32 hours of no pay. So when you're calculating the retirement benefit, you can use the knowledge that the person's scheduled for 40 hours to make an adjustment that I'm going to go over very soon. So just backing up a little and talking generally, I'm going to be focusing on the average annual rate. And no matter what kind of retirement allowance you're calculating, the statute always mentions an average annual rate. So the adjustment I'm going to do here, you can do whether it's the superannuation covered in section 5, ordinary disability is in section 6, but both of those talk about average annual rates. And accidental disabilities, section 7. The first one isn't an average annual rate because it's simply taking the annual rate on the date of injury. So here's a particular day you were hurt, we're going to annualize your check at that point. But the second one in the disability is an average annual rate over a 12-month period, the last 12 months that you receive compensation. So when I'm talking about an annual rate or an average annual rate, what do I mean? I'm just talking about taking your scheduled number of hours times your hourly pay times the number of weeks you work. So yes, if there's a school person, they might not be a 52-week year, but I'm going to assume people are 52-week years just for simplicity talking here. Now, theoretically, you could annualize every check within the 3-year period and then divide by 152 checks if you wanted to. But when people are full-time, you don't need to make any adjustments, obviously. But when people have no pay like this person does, the January 10th one is the first one in the booklet with no pay. And he was paid for 29 hours that week. So you could take the total paid, the 1,004, and divide by 29. You get an hourly rate. It's $34.64. If you multiply that by 40 hours, you come up to 1385.60. If you look at the check before the one with no pay, it was 1385.50. So there's a small rounding difference because I used 2 decimals instead of partial cents. You can carry it out to 4 or 5 decimals if you really want to make sure you're getting the exact number on the prior checks. But the 1385 is what you would use when you're calculating this person's retirement. All right, so now let's pretend that the reason there's all these weeks with no pay is because the person got injured. They were injured January 4th, so after that check on the 3rd. And they're going to apply for accidental disability, and eventually it will be approved. So we have to figure out how to calculate the accidental disability allowance. So John is going to go through the allowance steps. I'm going to do the salary part. He's going to take my salary and run with it. So yes, we're going to do the easy one first, because who starts with the hard one? The annual rate on the date of injury. So if you look back, the last full check the person got, or the annualized rate that we just did 2 slides ago, was 1385.50. So we're just multiplying that by 52 weeks. Yeah, $72,046. If this person got things like longevity or shift differential, or he was holding a license, so he got a stipend for that, you would add those on top, the full annual amount. They're part of the annual rate as well. In this case, this person didn't have any of those, so it's just the 72,046 for the first number. So the average annual rate for the last 12 months, I have the actual language from the statute there. So it's the last 12 months that you received regular compensation. So the adjustments I'm talking about, if the guy got no pay at all, you wouldn't do that or do what we're doing. But if you're paid for a little bit in a week, you can pretend you're paid for the full week. So his last check was September 26, 2018. And in the booklet, the payroll for February 2018 to September is actually starting on page 28. So it's after the slides. We're ending the booklet with all the weeks where there's no pay. At the final page of the booklet, you can see 9/26/2018 was the last pay. It was paid for 22 hours, not paid for 17. But that week is we're gonna get the 40-hour number for that week anyway. So we'll work backwards from 9/26 until we get to 52 weeks where he was paid something. And in this case, he didn't have any weeks with 0, so it will just be the last 52 weeks. The booklet does not have pay from October 2017 forward, but he wasn't injured at that point. We'll just assume that from October 2017 through the first check in January 2018 that we see, he was paid the same 1385.50. And then if you start filling in the 40-hour numbers, it goes all the way to the July 4th, 2018 check with the 1385.50. When you're looking at the payroll, July 11th, you will see a different amount. And then on July 18th, you'll see another different amount. In this case, it's because you got a raise on July 1st. So the July 11th check is partly the rate before July 1st and partly the rate after July 1st. So the July 18th check is the first one where the full check is at that rate, the higher rate after July 1. So that's pretty common what you see when you do these calculations. There'll be sort of an in-between week, and then once we get to 14, 13, 20 as his new rate, that's going to be the weekly one up until the end of his last check in September. So when we make all the 40-hour adjustments, we come up with a total of $72,376, which is different than what he was actually paid. He was actually paid $63,180. So you do the two disability numbers should be fairly close. I've seen folders while doing audits where a rate on the date of injury is 40 grand, and the last 12 months the board had like 20 grand. But that's what happens if you don't adjust the weeks that he did get money for the breaks. So the two numbers should be fairly close unless you have a years-long gap. So because the last 12 months are higher than the date, than the rate on the date of injury, we're going to use the last 12 months. And you can also ask yourself, does it make sense that the last 12 months are higher? So if someone is injured and never comes back, usually the rate on the date of injury will be higher than the last 12 months. But if you get injured, come back for a couple months, you're trying to see if you can still do the job, you'll probably end up with the last 12 months received being higher than the rate on the date of injury. Which, like what happened here, he had 3 months at a higher rate, so that got him another $300. Okay, so are there any questions? Okay, John Borak is up next.
All right. All right. Thank you, Scott. So what I'm going to be talking about today is how to do an accidental disability calculation. This presentation will piggyback the presentation that Ken Hill and Patrice Luby had done last week or 2 weeks ago in our office. Today, I'm going to talk about things such as the eligibility for an accidental disability, people who receive workers' compensation before retirement, calculating the allowance, and what happens when people receive workers' compensation after their retirement. And again, I'm going to ask people to hold off asking questions until the very end. So Chapter 32, Section 7, as quite a lengthy section. This is the pertinent part as to the eligibility for the benefit. To save time, I'm not going to read the entire slide. But essentially, a person is eligible for an accidental disability benefit if they were a member in service at the time of the injury was sustained or the hazard was undergone, so they must be a member in service. They must suffer an injury or a hazard while in the performance of their duties. The disability must be permanent, and there are no minimum age or service requirements to be eligible for an accidental disability benefit. Section 14.1 of Chapter 32 deals with what happens when a person receives workers' compensation before they retire. And the passage I want to highlight is the one that's in blue. It's during the period while he is receiving payments for total incapacity. So the first thing that we're concerned with is a person has to be receiving workers' compensation for total incapacity for these provisions to apply. And essentially what the Section 14.1 goes on to say is that the person shall receive creditable service for the period of time they're on workers' compensation. The board is supposed to keep track of the contributions the member would have made while they're out on workers' compensation. And at the time of retirement, they would transfer money from their pension fund of the system where the member was injured to the annuity savings fund where the member retires from, if at that time the additional money would provide an increased retirement allowance. And that really applies to people who are not subject to the 75% cap, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, or someone who is subject to the 75% cap, but they have such small service that the annuity portion doesn't make up the 3% difference. Okay, so as I said, the member retains the rights as member in service, the credible service, keep track of the contributions. Okay, in limited circumstances, if a person is receiving workers' compensation for partial incapacity, they could receive creditable service. It's a case Petrucci versus PERAC, CR 07-84. And what the court had determined was that the member was on workers' compensation for partial incapacity, but she tried to go back to work, or she did go back to work part-time for the same employer she was working for when she was injured. And the court determined that in that case, she would be entitled to the credible service because she did return to work for the same employer. And we highlight this in PERAC member number 22 from 2010. Okay, everyone's favorite decision regarding workers' compensation is the Vernava decision. And what this decision says is any payment received as a supplement to his or her workers' compensation is not to be considered regular compensation for retirement purposes. And this applies to all members, not just those retiring under Section 7. So how do we calculate the effective date of retirement for someone retiring on accidental disability? Pursuant to Section 7.2, there are 3 possible dates to use to determine the effective date of retirement. And it's the most recently occurring or the latest of the 3 following dates. The first is the date the injury was sustained. The second is the date 6 months prior to the filing of the application with the board. And the third is the date on which the member last received regular compensation. So an example of how this would work, let's assume the date the injury was sustained was May 20th of 2023. The member applied for the disability benefit on October 9th of 2023. So 6 months prior to that would be April 9th of 2023. And the date on which the member last received regular compensation was September 27th of 2023. Of those 3 dates, May 20th, April 9th, and September 27th, September 27th is the latest date, so that would be the effective date of this member's retirement. So as Scott just pointed out, there are 2 compensation figures to use. The first is the annual rate on the date of injury. The second is the average annual rate of regular comp. For the last 12 months, the member received regular compensation immediately preceding the date of retirement. So what happens if a member is working in a temporary or acting position at the time of the injury? The statute says you're still going to use the greater of the 2 amounts, and it's the annual rate of regular compensation for his or her permanent position on the date of injury. And for the average annual rate, you're going to look at the average annual rate for his or her permanent position on the date of injury. So the only difference between the 2 is if a member is working out of grade, at the time of injury, you're going to go back and use the pay for their permanent position, not the acting position. So when a member retires for accidental disability, the member can choose one of 3 options to have their benefit calculated under. Option A, option B, and option C. These are the same options that are available to someone who retires under a superannuation, let's say. At the time of retirement, all 3 retirement options are determined to be actuarially equivalent. What that means is at the date of retirement, all 3 benefits have the same actuarial present value. So in theory, the member is indifferent as to which option is selected. The actuarial equivalence only holds at the date of retirement. Once a person is retired for any length of time, actuarial equivalence no longer holds. So under option A is the greatest retirement allowance a person can receive. The allowance commences at retirement and terminates at the member's death. There's no benefit for survivors. Option B is a slightly smaller allowance. It's typically 1 to 5% less than the option A benefit. And under option B, the annuity paid to the member is slightly less than under option A. And it's paid, again, option B is paid for the lifetime of the member. And upon the death of the retiree, if there is an unpaid balance in the annuity reserve account, that balance is paid to the beneficiary or beneficiaries of record in one lump sum, and that's the final payment for that record. Under option C, again, the allowance starts at retirement, and upon the death of the retiree, if the retiree dies first, the beneficiary receives 2/3 of the amount the member was receiving on the date of his or her death. Or if the beneficiary predeceases the member's benefit pops up to option A. And the option C allowance is typically 7 to 12% less than the option A benefits. And I'm going to do an example of how to calculate a benefit under all three options. So the benefit formula for calculating a disability is the pension portion of the benefit is equal to 72% of the regular compensation figure. To that, we're going to add an annuity, which is based on the annuity savings fund balance of the member, multiplied by an annuity factor based on the member's age and option selected. The sum of the annuity and the pension is the allowance, plus if there's an applicable veteran or dependent allowance, those would be added to the allowance as well. Okay, in Chapter 32, there's also a 75% cap. So when is an allowance not capped? If the person became a member prior to January 1st, 1988, and has been continuously a member in service since that date, the 75% cap would not apply. The 75% cap would apply if the person became a member after January 1st, 1988, or became a member on or before January 1st, 1988, but has not been continuously a member in service since that date. So to calculate the allowance under the 75% cap, again, you'll calculate the disability benefit as before. You take the pension, or you find the pension, which is 72% of the regular compensation figure, add the annuity together, that equals the allowance. You compare this amount to the 75% limit on the regular compensation. Once you have the 75% cap, you would add the veterans allowance and the dependent allowance on top of that 75% number. So I mentioned the veterans allowance and the dependent allowance. The veterans allowance is available to retirement systems who have accepted the local option, and the veterans allowance is the same as it is for the superannuation benefits. It's $15 a year for each year of credible service or fraction thereof, up to a maximum benefit of $300. The dependent allowance is available to all retirees. For the systems that have accepted the local option, the current amount is $1,092.60 for each dependent child. The amount increases each year if a COLA is granted by the general court. The general court is essentially the state and teachers retirement systems. So if they adopt a COLA, then the dependent allowance would increase. If they do not, the dependent allowance does not increase, even if the local board passes its own COLA. For the few systems that have not accepted the local option, the dependent allowance payable is $312. Okay, for the supplemental dependent allowance, a child is considered dependent if he or she is unmarried and under the age of 18, or under the age of 22 and a full-time student, or at any age if they're mentally or physically incapacitated from earning. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of different calculations. The first one is where the 75% cap does not apply. The second one is where the 75% cap does apply. So Scott went through and figured out the regular compensation for this member. The greater of the two numbers is the $72,377. Unlike Scott, I rounded to the nearest whole dollar to make the math a little easier for me. So this member is 63 years old in 10 months. The beneficiary is 59 years old in 10 months. The beneficiary is used for option C purposes only. Person became a member on January 1st, 1987, so prior to the 1988 date. Person was continuously a member in service until the date of retirement, January 1st, 2024. This member is a veteran, 37 years of service. And the person has an annuity savings fund balance of $175,000. So to calculate the allowance under option A, first you're going to calculate the pension portion. So that's 72% of the regular compensation figure, which in this case, after rounding, is $52,111.44. Next, we calculate the annuity under option A. We take the accumulated deductions or the ASF balance, multiply it by the appropriate option A annuity factor. And in this case, it's for a member age 64 years old. The factor is 0.00822. Multiply those two numbers together to get the monthly annuity. Multiply by 12 to get the annual annuity. So the annual annuity ends up being $17,262. This person is a veteran. The person has more than 20 years of service, so is eligible for the maximum $300 veteran allowance. So the uncapped allowance for this person under option A would be $69,673.44. To calculate the benefit under option B, we're just going to calculate the option B annuity and add that to the pension portion from the option A calculation. The option B annuity factor is 0.00782 multiplied by the accumulated deductions of $175,000, gives a monthly annuity of $1,368.50, or an annual option B annuity of $16,422. We add that to the pension and the veterans allowance. And we get an option B disability allowance of $68,833.44. Now to calculate the option C benefit, this is a little tricky. When we calculate the allowance portion, we need to back out the veterans allowance because we're going to add it back in a second. So to calculate the annuity or the allowance, you take the monthly option A annuity or the monthly option A allowance, multiply it by the appropriate option C factor. The resulting product, you want to make sure it's divisible by 3. So for the annuity, the monthly annuity under option A was $1438.50, multiplied by the option C factor of 80.8760. That multiplication results in a monthly option C annuity of $1,260.13. That's not divisible by 3. To get it divisible by 3, we're ultimately going to take a penny away. So the final option C annuity would be $1,260.12. To calculate the allowance, again, we find the allowance without the veterans benefit, multiply that by the option C factor. In that case, we get a monthly option C allowance before the veterans allowance of $5,064.26. To this, we're going to add the full monthly veterans benefit of $25. And the reason we do this adjustment, if we were to include the veterans allowance before we multiply by the option C factor, then that veterans benefit is going to be reduced by the option C factor, and the veteran would not be receiving his full $300. So by moving the $25 monthly benefit after the calculation, we're ensuring that the member receives the full $300 veterans allowance. So we add the veterans allowance to the monthly option C allowance, and we make it divisible by 3. In this case, the monthly option C allowance would be $5,089.26. You subtract the annuity from the allowance to get the pension portion. Monthly would be $3,829.14. You multiply the monthly amounts by 12 to get the annual amounts. And now we're going to look at somebody who is subject to the 75% cap. So the member is 49 years old, the beneficiary is 52. This person became a member on January 1st, 2015, retired on January 1st, 2024. This person is not a veteran. 9 years of service, again, has the same regular compensation figure that Scott had determined, the $72,377. And it has a much smaller annuity balance. This person has an annuity balance of $35,000. So we do the same steps as we had done before. We figure out the pension portion of the allowance by taking the regular compensation figure and multiplying it by 72%. Same regular compensation figure, so we have the same pension of $52,111.44. To find the annuity, again, you take the accumulated deductions, multiply it by the appropriate option A annuity factor. And this gives us a monthly annuity of $228.90, or an annual annuity of $2,746.80. So our uncapped allowance is the sum of the annuity and the pension, or $54,858.24. Next, we compare this to 75% of the regular compensation figure used earlier. 75% of this regular compensation gives us a number of $54,282.72 after adjusting for monthly payments. So the disability benefit would be the smaller of those two numbers. So in this case, the benefit is subject to the 75% cap. So the allowance would be the $54,282.72. Once we have this amount, we would allocate this to annuity and pension, which I don't show on this page. You would use the same annuity and subtract the annuity from that smaller amount to get the new pension amount. So the pension amount paid would be slightly less than 72%. To find the option B benefit, you would do the same thing you had done for the uncapped allowance. You're going to take the pension portion from the option A calculation. You're going to add it to the option B annuity, which is found by taking the accumulated deductions, multiplying it by the appropriate option B annuity factor. In this case, we get an annual option B annuity of $2,717.40 added to the option A pension. $51,535.92 gives us an option B calculation under the cap of $54,253.32. To calculate the option C with the 75% cap, we're going to do it the same way. We're going to take the monthly allowance amount and the monthly annuity amount and multiply those by the appropriate option C factor. And again, once we do that multiplication, we want to make sure that the product is divisible by 3. We take the monthly option A annuity of $228.90, multiply it by the option C factor of 0.9589. We get an amount of $219.49, making it divisible by 3. In this case, we also take a penny away. So the option C annuity final number would be $219.48. Calculate the allowance. You take the monthly allowance, the $45,2356, multiply it by the same option C factor to come up with the monthly option C allowance of $4,337.64, which is divisible by 3. And because I have a little bit of time, I want to show people a little trick to figure out how a number is divisible by 3. And this works for a number of any length. It works for numbers that have 3-digit. It works for numbers that have 103 digits. So what you do is you take the number and you add the individual digits up. So let's look at the monthly option C allowance, the $4,337.64. You take 4 plus 3 is 7, plus 3 is 10, plus 7 is 17, plus 6 is 23. I'm sorry. So this is really actuary. Shows he's really not good at math. So 4 plus 3 is 7. 7 plus 3 is 10. 10 plus 7 is 17. 17 plus 6 is 23. Plus 4 is 27. 27 is divisible by 3. And to check that, you can take the 2 plus 7, which is 9. 9 is divisible by 3, so that entire number is divisible by 3. If we look up above, the 2, 1949, 2 plus 1 is 3, plus 9 is 12, plus 4 is 16, plus 9 is 25. 25 is not divisible by 3, so you want to look at the number above it or the number below it. The number above 25 is 26. 26 is also not divisible by 3. One below it, 24. 24 is divisible by 3. So you take 1 away from that number to get a number that is divisible by 3. Okay, now that we have the final option C allowance and annuity amount, you subtract to get the pension amount. And you multiply by 12 to get the annual amounts. Okay, so now what happens if a person is still receiving workers' compensation after their retirement? Well, according to section 14.2, there would be an offset of their disability benefit. So the benefit is offset if a person is receiving workers' compensation under Chapter 152, Sections 31, 34, 34 Big A, 34 Big B, 35, and 35A. So the pension portion of the disability allowance is what is offset. The annuity portion is not subject to offset. The veterans allowance is not subject to offset, but the dependent allowance would be. So I don't show the calculation, but the way the offset would work is you would calculate the pension portion of the allowance on the same basis as the workers' compensation. In most cases, workers' compensation is paid weekly. So we would divide the annual pension by 52 to get a weekly pension and a weekly offset, weekly workers' compensation amount. You subtract the workers' compensation amount from the pension portion. If the number is positive, that's the amount of allowance that's paid to the member. If the amount is negative or 0, there is no pension payable, and the person would only receive their annuity portion or the veterans allowance if applicable. Okay, so that concludes my part of the presentation. Does anyone have any questions for me, or does anyone have any questions for Scott as well? This hand was up here first.
I just have a question on where the annuity factor.
The annuity factor is calculated by the actuary. It's based on a mortality table and an interest rate. The factors get reviewed every 10 years, but they're numbers that are published by PERAC.
Will the pamphlet for this be available on either PERAC's website or?
I got a thumbs up, so yeah, it'll be available at least on the PERAC website. And I've also been told that we are secretly being recorded right now, so there will also be a recording of this as well. And hopefully they edit the part out where the actuary can't do simple addition. Are there any other questions? All right, thank you.